The syndicate was not a loose band of hobbyist hackers. It was an assembly line of specialists, each role honed for a narrow purpose and protected by rigid compartmentalization. At its core were 5 functional groups: the intruders who wrote and deployed code, the recon operators who mapped networks, the hardware teams who performed jackpotting or black box installs, the mule organizers who recruited cash-out crews, and the laundering cell that made the proceeds disappear. Together, they created an economy that rewarded discretion and technical skill. The intruders were coders comfortable with low-level systems. They reverse-engineered ATM firmware, analyzed vendor manuals, and wrote modules that could talk to dispensers and management consoles. Their code was modular, a loader to gain persistence, a communications module to reach command servers, and a dispenser controller that could issue cache commands while erasing or falsifying logs. These developers maintained strict OPSEC, virtual machines, throwaway email accounts, and encrypted channels. Their work resembled legitimate software development, iteration, bug fixes, and staged rollouts. Recon operators served as the syndicate's intelligence arm. They infiltrated bank networks and observed daily routines. They watched teller behaviors, maintenance schedules, and backup practices. They cataloged the make and model of ATMs, noted which machines were physically easier to access, and identified times when CCTV coverage or foot traffic was minimal. Recon was patient work. Months of observation could make the difference between a successful night and an embarrassing failure. Hardware teams bridged the digital with the physical. Some attacks required no hardware at all, but where black box or drilled hole methods were used, skilled technicians executed near-surgical operations. A drilled hole jackpotting job required finesse. Remove a maintenance panel, thread a controller inside, connect to the dispenser serial port, and reassemble the unit without leaving visible marks. In other operations, teams used uniformly-looking service vans and fake work orders to mass presence while attaching wireless black boxes that could be remotely triggered once the network command initiated a dispense. Mule organizers were the human logistics commanders. They ran recruitment cells on criminal forums, social media groups, or through local intermediaries. Offers promised quick pay for minimal effort. Arrive at a designated ATM at a precise time and collect cash. Mules were often strangers to one another, instructed to avoid communicating with other recruits and to burn phones after use. Payments were immediate and in cash. Little was funneled through traceable banking channels at this stage. Organizers insulated themselves from street-level operatives with layers of middlemen and prepaid instruments that erased direct links. The laundering cell closed the circle. They specialized in converting raw cash into usable assets without drawing attention. Techniques ranged from legitimate-looking shell companies issuing fake invoices, to bulk purchases of high-value goods that could cross borders, to mixing cash through small deposits at numerous branches. In later years, cryptocurrencies were woven into the mix. Cash converted into stablecoins, run through mixers or tumblers, and eventually cashed out in jurisdictions with lax KYC enforcement. Launderers relied on a global set of service providers, accountants, corrupt intermediaries, and complicit small businesses that created the illusion of lawful commerce. The marketplace that sustained the syndicate was an ecology of services. On underground forums, you could buy a dispenser control module, rent a command and control server, or hire a mule organizer for a flat fee. Tutorials and turnkey kits spread techniques quickly. A developer in one city could sell a tested exploit to an operator in another. A laundering contact could advertise his services to multiple crews. This commodification lowered the technical bar for entry. Less skilled actors could buy capabilities rather than invent them. Recruitment exploited social and economic vulnerabilities. Many mules were young men and women from economically depressed areas, tempted by well-paid, short-term work. Others were complicit professionals, cash handlers, taxi drivers, or small business owners, who could hide transactions within their legitimate day jobs. Law enforcement found that disrupting recruitment networks was one of the most effective interventions. Choke off the supply of disposable cash collectors, and the operation's velocity slowed. Inside the syndicate culture, secrecy was enforced by both technology and social practice. Communications used ephemeral messaging platforms and one-time contact methods. Payments to middlemen used untraceable instruments. Code repositories were purged after deployment. When arrests occurred, prisoners revealed little. Non-disclosure was a practical survival trait. Even within cells, trust was rare. Members were judged by performance, not by personal loyalty. Yet rigid compartmentalization had weaknesses. Middlemen, once arrested, could offer investigators critical breadcrumbs, phone records, travel receipts, and strings of cash deposits. Laundering intermediaries left financial footprints. Testimony from low-level participants exposed routes and timing. Prosecutors used these fragments to construct narratives that connected code to cash. It was never a single smoking gun. It was dozens of small, mundane slips that, when compiled, produced a convincing case. The syndicate's supply chain also created opportunities for defenders. Vendors and manufacturers became reluctant partners. When software patches and hardware redesigns were proposed, vendors moved to harden maintenance ports, improve authentication, and offer tamper-evident casings. Banks invested in segmentation, isolating ATM control networks from general IT systems and enforcing multi-factor authentication for any remote administrative access. These mitigations raised the cost of operation and forced criminals to innovate or move on. Regulation and policy attempted to catch up. Financial authorities pressured banks to report suspicious dispense anomalies and to share telemetry that could reveal coordinated cash-outs. International cooperation increased. Europol and Interpol hosted joint operations that combined local raids with cyber takedowns. Public-private partnerships matured. Security firms shared indicators of compromise with banks and law enforcement, who then used that intelligence to identify and interdict mule networks. Despite these gains, the syndicate evolved. Tools were sold and repackaged. Stolen code served as templates for copycats. As jurisdictions hardened, operations migrated to softer targets, smaller banks, emerging markets, or regions with brittle law enforcement. The cycle of exposure and adaptation continued. Defenders tightened one door. The criminals found another entrance. At its heart, the touch-free model thrived because it exploited the seams between digital defenses and real-world logistics. The attack surface was not just a server or a dispenser. It was the whole chain: people, processes, hardware, and money flows. Effective defense required an integrated approach: engineering fixes, personnel training, legal reform, and international coordination. When the headlines finally named arrests and indictments, the public saw only a sliver of a much larger, quieter battle. The visible victories, the news releases, the seized cash, the handcuffs, were important. They disrupted operations, rattled networks, and provided prosecutors with evidence. But the deeper story was less dramatic and more enduring: a global ecosystem changing shape in response to a new kind of theft. Banks tightened controls. Legacy ATMs were retrofitted or retired. Remote administration moved behind stronger authentication and tighter network segmentation. Vendors redesigned service ports and introduced tamper-evident hardware. Cybersecurity teams adopted behavior-based detection, tuned to the rhythms of money movement rather than just signature-based antivirus. Those changes reduced the low-hanging fruit. They increased the cost and complexity of successful attacks. Yet technology fixes alone proved insufficient. The syndicate had exploited human systems as readily as technical ones. Weak processes, poor patch management, shared service accounts, and insufficiently monitored maintenance procedures remained exploitable. Training and culture change became core defenses. Banks instituted regular phishing simulations, hardened onboarding for privileged accounts, and enforced the principle of least privilege across IT staff. When people learned to treat routine alerts as potentially dangerous, attackers lost a predictable vector. Policy and cooperation matured alongside technical defenses. Regulators began to require better incident reporting and faster information sharing across borders. Public-private task forces formed to coordinate takedowns that combined cyber disruption with synchronized arrests of mule networks. These operations were delicate. Timing mattered. A premature arrest could scatter evidence, while a delayed operation allowed criminals to exfiltrate funds. When properly executed, Coordinated actions exposed the full supply chain, from exploit to dispenser to wallet. The laundering arms of the syndicate also faced new pressure. Financial institutions improved AML, anti-money laundering, analytics, and created red flags for unusual cash flows tied to geographically dispersed ATM withdrawals. Payment processors and cryptocurrency exchanges strengthened KYC and monitoring, closing convenient exits for illicit funds. In some prosecutions, the greatest breakthroughs came not from malware analysis, but from tracing the money into a seemingly legitimate business and proving that its invoices were worthless paper. Still, a persistent tension remained. Defenders must anticipate threats that evolve far faster than regulations or procurement cycles. Attacks that succeeded in 2010 often reappeared in mutated form a few years later. The lesson was stark. Security is not a static project, but an ongoing program requiring investment, attention, and institutional memory. There was, however, a deeper societal cost that statistics could not capture. Small community banks and the customers they served bore disproportionate impacts. A regional bank crippled by a cash-out wave faced years of recovery and reputational harm. Employees who unknowingly contributed to access vectors carried the burden of investigation and stigma. Mules, often young and economically vulnerable, faced criminal charges that changed their lives. The syndicate's quiet crimes were not victimless. They rippled outward in both obvious and unseen ways. Looking forward, several practical principles emerged as the core of prevention. First, assume compromise. Design systems so that a single successful phishing click cannot yield full control. Microsegmentation, multi-factor authentication for administrative access, and strict separation of duties make lateral movement far harder and more detectable. Second, monitor behavior, not just signatures. Attackers evolve their code. They are less likely to reuse identical signatures. However, they still produce behavioral fingerprints, sudden synchronized dispense commands, unusual administrative logins, or atypical rebalancing transactions. Sophisticated anomaly detection, combined with rapid escalation procedures, can catch activity before cash is handed to mules. Third, harden physical attack surfaces. Tamper-evident casings, sealed maintenance panels, and service ports designed to resist black box attachments raise the operational cost for hardware teams. Routine physical inspection protocols and authenticated maintenance processes remove easy opportunities for clandestine installs. Fourth, choke the human logistics. Disrupt recruitment channels, improve community awareness to reduce mule pools, and prosecute money movement intermediaries aggressively. Without reliable cash-out crews and laundering pathways, the digital intrusion yields little reward. Fifth, invest in international coordination. Cyber-enabled cash theft is inherently transnational. Swift mutual legal assistance, standardized incident reporting, and joint operations shorten the window between intrusion detection and enforcement action, and that window is the syndicate's most vulnerable moment. Finally, share intelligence widely. Private sector research saved lives in this fight. The technical reports, the malware indicators, the laundering patterns. When banks and law enforcement treat intelligence as a shared public good, defenders collectively harden faster than attackers can adapt. The story of the touch-free robbery is not an endpoint. It is a mirror. It reflects how modern infrastructure, distributed, connected, and often designed for convenience, can be weaponized when human processes lag behind innovation. It shows how attackers combine technical knowledge with social engineering, logistics, and financial acumen to convert code into cash. And it reveals a blunt truth. In a world of thin margins and globalized crime, the incentives to exploit these seams will persist. Yet there is cause for cautious optimism. Each arrest, each hardened system, each disrupted mule network narrows the playground for criminals. The syndicate model demonstrated that organization and specialization create power, but those same features create points of failure. The more we study their methods, the better we become at closing the seams they exploit. For defenders, the work is relentless. It requires continuous investment in people, processes, and technology. It requires empathy for those who fall prey to recruitment and a commitment to pursue laundering networks wherever they surface. It demands international solidarity and a willingness to view financial systems through the dual lenses of convenience and risk. In the dim glow of an ATM screen, it may be impossible to see the long path that a single banknote has traveled. But that path, through code, courier, safe house, and shell company, can be followed, interrupted, and eventually closed. The touch-free robbery will adapt, so must we. The difference between a future where such heists are rare and one where they are routine will come down to choices made now. To invest in resilience, to share intelligence, and to treat the quiet theft of cash with the urgency it deserves. When the machines go dark and the cameras blink on, the lesson remains. Vigilance wins where assumptions fail.